Welcome back to these series of lectures on Western civilization. Last time we met, we talked about the Mongol Empire, and today we're going to link the Mongols to Marco Polo and to Christopher Columbus. It's very interesting, this story of Marco Polo. It's wrapped in mystery to a degree. We're going to do a little speculating here. That's what historians do. They argue and they speculate as they search for evidence. So let me frame this discussion like this. Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant, grew up in a merchant family. As a young man, he accompanied his uncle and his father deep into Central Asia to Mongolia. Later, as an adult, he would return to Mongolia and then to China. While in China, he would stay and work directly for Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler over China. We know these things because Polo wrote a book about them. Polo, according to his testimony, remained in China until about 1299, I believe, and then returned to Italy, returned to Venice. Upon his return, he got caught up in a dispute. The Italian city-states were at war, and Polo got caught up in this conflict and ended up as a POW and was jailed. It just so happened that he shared a jail cell with a gentleman, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was a writer. And I guess Polo and this gentleman began to talk, and it became rapidly clear that Polo had seen and done more than most men can imagine, having traveled across Eurasia, having worked with the Great Khan. Polo describes the Great Khan as the world's most powerful and wealthy man, and this is probably true. He ruled over the largest country in the world, China. And China at this point, technologically, was far advanced over Europe. Great cities, great technological wonders. And Polo describes these things in his book. The book is called The Creation of the World. And in this book, and there are numerous variations of this book, and there are other titles, in fact. The book itself, I've had a copy for years, and I've read it a few times. The book itself is long stretches of very tedious, boring list of trade items. And missing from the book are those cultural peculiarities of China. This is what struck me. I read another book some years later. A historian made the argument that perhaps Polo never went to China because he did not mention things that we think of as being peculiar to China, cultural things as opposed to trade items. Again, Polo's a merchant. Perhaps he was just did not view these cultural oddities as interesting. Yet, we need to remember, too, that this book was inspired by his conversations with his cellmate. And the cellmate encouraged Polo to tell his stories. And this writer slash cellmate would put them down on paper and perhaps embellish them, give them a narrative flow. At any rate, this book has been out there for centuries now. You find it in every library, every bookstore. I'm sure you can find it online now. So I want to talk about a few of these cultural oddities that Polo does not mention. First, chopsticks. Now, again, Polo was in China for 17 years? So perhaps he just got used to chopsticks and did not regard it as something worth mentioning. But it does seem odd that it wouldn't come up. In addition to that, we have Chinese script, which looks nothing like Western script. In fact, I believe you even read from top to bottom as opposed from left to right as we do in the West. He doesn't mention this either. Perhaps, again, he just got used to it and didn't think of it as being significant. Polo also doesn't mention something I find extremely curious, and that's foot binding. Elite Chinese women have bound feet. And we're talking about just a fraction of the population here. The vast majority of Chinese women have feet just like everybody else. But there's this very, very, very small percentage of elite women whose feet are bound. Now this process begins when the woman is an infant. Her feet are bound, the toes are turned under and then wrapped, and this process continues, so that by the time a Chinese woman reaches her sexual maturity, she doesn't really have feet anymore. She has little hooves. Now, this may seem very odd to people in the West. As a historian, we have to ask a simple question: why? Why do we do this? It's certainly a cultural symbol of elite status. If you meet a Chinese woman with bound feet, you know that she is among the wealthy. She does not have to work. She's a kept woman in some sense. So it's a cultural symbol of status, high status. And it is also apparently a sexual fetish. When it comes to these things, I say to each their own, but this is one fetish that goes over my head. You can see pictures of this, and you can wonder to yourself why Chinese men find this attractive. Nevertheless, this is a cultural oddity in China, and these are the very women that Polo is spending time with, these elite women in the court. Yet he never mentions this, and it's quite striking that this cultural peculiarity would go unmentioned. Other things, cormorant fishing, common method of fishing in China. Here we use the cormorant, a river bird. The Chinese fisherman tethers the bird to a pole, puts a piece of pliable metal around the bird's neck and tightens it just enough to keep the bird from swallowing, not enough to injure the bird. After this, the Chinese fishermen cast the cormorant, and the cormorant goes into the river and does what cormorants have been doing for thousands of years. They catch a fish. They bring the fish back to the Chinese fisherman, who takes it out of the cormorant's mouth, since he can't swallow the fish, puts it in his bamboo basket, and then casts the cormorant again. Now, this is a common method of fishing in China, yet Polo never mentions it. Elite Chinese men will often grow their fingernails to excessive lengths. Why is this significant? Well, these are the very people that Polo claims to be working with and around, and yet he never mentions it. Now, the purpose here, I suppose, for Chinese men and long fingernails is similar to elite Chinese women and bound feet. It's a cultural symbol of high status. Yet Polo never mentions it. He also never mentions probably one of the grandest man-made objects on this planet. I remember hearing somebody say one time that this was the only man-made structure that you could see from outer space. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is interesting to think about. Of course, I'm talking about the Great Wall. The wall extends across northern China near the Mongolian border. Its purpose, of course, is to keep Mongol horsemen out of China. Obviously, it did not work in this case, Kublai Khan himself being a Mongol horseman. This is a couple of days' ride north of Peking by horseback, and Polo never mentions it. It's very difficult to believe that he did not see it, since he traveled throughout China, and the wall is reasonably close to Beijing, but he never mentions it. All these cultural oddities seem to have no interest for Marco Polo. Now, some people have suggested, like I said, that this is evidence that Polo did not actually do what he said he did. His book is full of detailed descriptions of trade items, and I will emphasize that he is a merchant, so maybe that's all he was interested in. But when you're writing a book for a European audience about China, you would think that you would include those peculiar things indigenous to the Chinese. Now, I need to add a couple more things to this lecture. In the century after Polo, another book was published, quite similar, sort of a travel log of exotic places. The author was Sir John Mandeville, an English knight. I believe he traveled to North Africa, the Middle East. He went all the way to China. Again, similar to Polo's book. In fact, if you read Polo's book and enjoyed it, you would probably read Sir John Mandeville's book, simply called The Travels. We discovered, I think in the 19th century, that Mandeville's travels were entirely fictitious, entirely made up. Apparently, a French priest with access to a good library simply cobbled together stories and details from travel accounts and merchants and missionaries and soldiers, and put together this sort of composite character, Sir John Mandeville, and created adventures for him. This begs the question, did Polo do the same? Polo's family had a sort of emporium on the Black Sea, and Polo spent part of his life there. And he would have certainly come into contact with just a wide variety of exotic people, Arabs and Jews and Russians and Turks and Christians and Buddhists and Muslims and you name it. Is it possible that he could have simply collected stories there for his later adventures in Kublai Khan's Yuan Empire? I don't know, and I don't think it's terribly important, but it is a historical curiosity. This is what makes it really interesting. In 1492, when Columbus sets sail, he is headed back to China. He has read Marco Polo's book. He's made annotations and notes in the book. In fact, I believe we still have Columbus's copy of the description of the world by Polo. When he sets sail to go west across the Atlantic to China in 1492, Columbus has aboard his ship two books, the Bible and Polo's description of the world. He uses both for geographic information, as odd as that sounds, and annotates both of these books. So it's interesting to think that the book that in part inspired Columbus to return to the Far East may have been cobbled together by a man whose adventures were partly made up, at least. Again, we can't prove this one way or the other. It's a question that's been debated now for centuries, and I guess it will continue to be something of a mystery. So this is how we link the Mongol Empire to Marco Polo, to Christopher Columbus. This tends to complicate our old story of the discovery of the New World, and then afterward the spreading of European culture throughout not only the New World, but throughout the world, from Africa, Asia, and so on. So I'm going to end this lecture here. Next, we'll get more formally into Columbus. We'll talk about Columbus's pitch and his maps, Columbus's world, and then finally the Columbian Exchange. Thank you for your attention.